Hello, my friends. John and I chatted a bit about an hour ago, prepping for this hour-long discussion on gain staging. So, should be an interesting one. Got lots and lots of questions. We have lots of thoughts on it. Let me bring John on here. Bringing him on shortly. What up, Ben? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you as well. How are you, my friend?
I'm fantastic.
I talked to you a bit earlier. How's your mix going?
Do we both have holes in our shirt?
Yes, we do. That's right. I saw yours earlier when we chatted, and I was like, I'm gonna get the old school No Effects shirt.
Sick.
I got when I was like 12 years old. It's nice and vintage.
Yeah.
How you doing? Did you finish up your mix? You said you were mixing a little bit earlier.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I needed a break from it, so I took 20 minutes away before we jumped on here. Just it was actually one of the first in a while to be killing me. Like, I don't understand this kind of straight up pop music. It's just like there's nothing interesting about it. I'll keep the name of the artist out, obviously. Of course. It's just like not interesting at all.
Is it just something that you feel like everything is like numerically correct, but there's no heart, no soul, that kind of thing?
Sure. I don't know what numerically correct necessarily means. I mean, watch it be like the biggest song I work on. I'll tell nobody I did it. It's just like, oh God. It's one of those decisions, like you say yes to a gig and you're like, well, I actually don't really want people to know, just for the fact that I don't want to be hired for this style of music constantly. Because it's not my forte, and it doesn't give me the feedback that I'm looking for in a project.
That's an interesting discussion for another time, of course, because we're going to do gain staging today. But every time I've had a successful song, immediately, and it's great news, but it's an interesting conundrum that you immediately get hired or people ask you to do the same thing you just did over and over.
Yes, you might as well love it.
Yeah, and even, and even if you love the thing that you did, like, my first hit was this Andy Grammer song, Fine By Me, which is like a hot AC hit here.
Oh, I know that song.
Yeah.
I think I was supposed to mix that song.
I don't think so, because I mixed it.
Yeah, but I think I was supposed.
Maybe.
I think Tony and I were supposed to mix that back in the day.
Maybe
they probably just had you do it instead.
They used my.
Or you said, I want to mix it.
Honestly, I don't think they had any more money because they didn't pay me that much for it. It was like an indie label, or an indie through a major. But like for the next year, everybody's like, "Can we do a song like that?" And I was like, "I already did that. I want to do something else."
Yeah, exactly.
But also maybe a different thing as a producer writer versus a mixer. You can do all kinds of... Anyway, So today we decided, the last few weeks there have been lots of questions about gain staging. And so we decided that we will do the whole hour today on it. And I figured, you and I talked earlier because I wanted to make sure we're on the same page. I think the best way to do it is to kind of do it in an arc over the hour where we do some basics at the beginning and then get into more nuanced stuff and get into questions and that sort of thing. I figure... Since you are probably the expert on a lot of the questions that people have from a mixing standpoint, I will start out and give my overall thoughts on it, and then you can kind of take it from there and correct me where I'm wrong, or give nuanced opinions, that sort of thing. So there were people that were asking really specific questions, and then there were people that were asking like, what is gain staging? So I think it's worth going through it from my perspective. Basically. Gain staging and signal flow are very intertwined. They're worth both Googling and checking out. But the idea basically is that at every step of the recording, mixing, music creation process, every single step, there is a dynamic range of whatever you are using. It starts with, in a lot of places, a microphone. There is a maximum amount of level that the microphone can take before it starts distorting. And then below a certain amount, it's just really noisy. Now, back in the day, and this includes in when you start recording things, you put something through a compressor, you're summing it in a computer. There's the loudest possible volume or the loudest possible sound and the quietest possible sound. There's a range. That's called dynamic range. And when you get to the top, you start distorting. And back in the day, when you were recording on tape machines, you had a smaller dynamic range where at the bottom there was a lot of hiss, a lot of noise. The noise floor was very high, and the top part of the dynamic range would start distorting. That's how you get tape saturation, things like that. And so recording engineers had to make things hot enough to where maybe distorted a little bit, but not too much, but maybe some sounds you could push more than others. But if you had a very dynamic sound, you'd want to use a compressor going into it because you wouldn't want to get this hissy sound when you start turning it up. But these days, with digital technology, you basically don't have to worry about the noise floor. So you don't have to worry about things being too quiet. Very often, there are places that can come into play. But I think for 99% of people, 99% of the time, what you're really worried about is the upper end of your dynamic range, because you get distortion. And digital distortion, although might be used as a creative tool occasionally, is mostly unpleasant. It kills transients. It does all the things you don't want to do for the most part. And so at every stage of recording, mixing, processing, mastering, all that kind of stuff, you are dealing with getting near the top end of the dynamic range, and you start to lose transients, you start to get distortion. Sometimes it's audible, sometimes it's not. And actually the stuff that's not as immediately audible might be more relevant to our discussions, because if you get a bunch of that and then you accumulate it together, you're losing fidelity and clarity. So basically at every stage of your signal flowing, from somebody singing in a room to a microphone to a preamp, compressor, EQ, getting into your digital audio workstation through your converters, whatever you're using at every stage, and plugins. Every plugin has a meter where things can hit the red. It has a dynamic range. So every step of the process, make sure that your signal is loud enough that it's coming through, but not so loud that you're going to be distorting. And I think one of the things that I certainly have done in the past and run into, and probably what we'll talk about a lot, is when you start taking a multi-track where lots and lots of individual signals that may not be clipping, and you add them together, you sum them into a master bus or subgroups or any of this sort of stuff. When you sum them together, they become louder than, the individual sounds themselves. So you need to be aware of what levels, how much gain is on all of these accumulated elements, how they add up, so that your sum total, your summing, doesn't then distort, and you keep your dynamic range. And so I think I'll let you take it from here, but there's discussions about, digital, the ceiling of digital is at 0. And so there's discussions of how close to 0 do you want to get? And I think I'll let you take it from here. I know we want to talk about things more philosophically, and then of course we'll get into more specific, but philosophically what we're talking about is signal flow and dynamic range at every step of the process, so that you are not distorting. So I don't know if you want to just sort of take a little bit from there. Yeah,
I mean, I'm normally best at describing real life circumstances. So this morning I was doing notes on a mix, and the producer asked to turn. This is as close to perfect of an example as I can come up with. It just happened. Command, like, this is all sounding great. Can we try the kick drum up 1.5 dB and the snare down 2 dB? And I was like, whoa, kick drum up 1.5 dB. And the way we mix these days, close to 0, like, as peak is 0 basically, and LUFS is whatever, and we've already talked about the differences there. I was like, sure, like, if that's what you want to hear, like, let's do it. I think I was able to get it up 1 dB without it distorting, but it started clamping down the mix, and like I could hear it move. But I'm like, all right, well, let's see what he thinks. I sent it, and producer goes, oh shit, yeah, now it sounds like it's hitting the compressor or limiter or something too hard. I'm like, yes, like that's obvious, but I'm not going to make that call if someone wants to hear their kick drum up. So where I come at gain staging is from headroom, right? So the kick, sometimes
headroom being, let's just define as we go, and I'll stop you if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Headroom is the room between where you're at and the peak level of, let's say, 0. How much room you have to go up, or is it conceptually anything? Headroom between where you're at and something compressing.
Well,
too much.
What's left before 0 from wherever? I mean, you have headroom in your life, within a day, right? You have like 24 hours. The closest you get, closer to get to sleep.
Headroom is how much you have left above your head before you hit the ceiling. I mean, that's where it comes from, right? The ceiling being 0. So how much room you have above the current level of any particular thing.
Yeah. So once I turn it up the way he asked, it started clamping the mix down. So it's starting to distort subtly. It's starting to compress differently than we had in the mix up to this point. And now the groove is going to change. Things are going to start to change. And his overall thought was, oh, well, now that the balances are where I want it, how about we just lower everything? I was like, oh, what a great note. So we just take everything down about a dB or two, created headroom, and now transits are starting to pop. It sounds less compressed. It starts to groove harder. Mix is done, right? So I could have just done that on the next pass. I could have taken all the faders down and left besides the kick and left it where it was at. And he might have said the same thing, but there's so much change that he would have noticed that's different than if he had to come to that with his own realization of, okay, now because the kick is up, you can see the train of events that occurred there. But I'm supposed to know how much headroom and know my gain staging. So when that note is given to me, I know how it's going to affect the mix. So I knew exactly what was going to happen there. So I understood the gain staging. And what I'd like to get across today is kind of understanding gain staging, not necessarily all the specifics on how to do, because I can't tell you put your kick at -6 because I'd be a hypocrite, because today on a pop mix I'm doing, the one that I don't really like very much, the kick is hitting at 0. But the rough mix and the vibe of it, everything's ducking on the kick, and not like a side chain. It sounds like a limiter being hit. And
on the master bus.
On the master bus. So that's the vibe. And no mixer or producer or finisher or anything wants to be the vibe killer of a record, ever. We want to either enhance vibe or leave vibe. So that's why I get hired. I don't ruin people's vibes. I enhance things appropriately within the headroom that I am either given or give myself. So let's start with the first thing I do in every mix to create headroom is I take every fader, and we're going to go through two ways. These are two specifics. I take every fader conceptually. I don't actually use the fader here, so this is really important, and we're going to come back to this in a second. I lower everything by 6 dB, and I give myself 6 dB of headroom to start, and then I A/B with the rough mix to hear what now the limiter is doing differently, so the vibe is changing. But I give myself 6 dB in every mix. Either I'm doing it or my assistant is doing it. I usually do it because I like my assistant to deliver me a mix prep that sounds exactly like the last rough mix that was sent by the producer, so the session corresponds to that. And then because it's a little bit bold and it takes a lot of work to kind of remake fine adjustments for a vibe. But I'm giving myself headroom. Now to do that, output faders or clip gain faders? Exactly. I clip gain everything because I want my faders to hit at 0. I want all my faders to be at 0 all the time, minus a couple of automation rides that I might do to move some things. But 0 is, from what I know, and I don't think it's changed once things went floating point, I'm pretty sure at 0, you're getting the best resolution in every DAW. The minute your faders are over 0, things start not sounding good. It could be psychological to me. I don't think it is, though. I'm pretty sure faders above 0 start to lose fidelity, and below dramatically, maybe like a few dB down. So to me, and I've been told this for years, so I kind of just go with this. I think it's a good place to start. Keep your faders at 0 as much as you possibly can. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky, and you might have to rewind the video to understand what I'm saying here a little bit. So you can't just clip gain, meaning I can't just take all the faders and clip gain, because there might be some saturator or a compressor or a limiter or some other sonic manipulating tool on that if you clip gain the input into that, the sound will now change, right? So you're creating yourself headroom thinking you're doing yourself a favor, but you're changing vibe now because you're changing that saturation amount, you're changing that compression amount, which is going to change the feel, like we always talk about with compression.
So, sorry, interrupt you real quick. This is what we talk about with signal flow. So you have a recorded audio file, and you are talking about clip gain, which is manipulating the level of the audio file before it hits any plugins, any effects, the input. But the problem, of course, as you're saying, and it's just the same as with your mix bus, where if you have a compressor after the audio and you're manipulating the volume here, it's going to go into the compressor and hit it differently.
Yes,
it'll hit your saturator differently.
So this is how to understand signal flow and gain staging.
Yeah.
You have to understand your input and your output, right? So when you're working to create headroom, determine where you're going to get your 6 dB or whatever you guys choose. I'm just like, I'm throwing out a number. I go 6 down because that to me seems like a middle ground of where it gives me enough room, but it doesn't lose vibe. And if it does, it's vibe I can get back with certain.
Well, and part of the reason what you're saying is if you're getting a mixed session from someone and it has stuff on drum bus, master bus, mix bus, that sort of thing, that like same thing with one signal going into a compressor. If all of the multitrack is going into a compressor and you reduce the volume, all this stuff, it's going to hit the compressor less. Everything changes. But the reason to do that is if you start with everything there, you don't have any headroom. You don't have anywhere to go up because, like you said, when you turned up the kick 1 dB on your mix this morning or whenever it was, then all of a sudden it changes dramatically how everything feels. So the reason you drop it is so then you have room to play in there before you then decide how much compression, because you're going to readjust things. You're not just readjusting the compression on the mix.
No, I don't AB with the rough minus 6 dB as well. The rough stays the same. So you have to hear the rough as it was sent. You have to hear the rough mix as was intended all the time. So my mix is going to sound so much quieter. And then I have to use my trained, mix engineer brain and ears to remake certain things. Like I was texting my homie Volta yesterday from OG Volta because I'm doing a mix for them. And I was like, yo, just letting you know that I'm going to take a while on this one because I'm going to rebuild your gain structure here because it was a co-production and they weren't loving exactly where they had it, which is for the first time because it's rare. They usually have it pre-dialed in. But I was up front. I was like, hey, I'm about to rebuild your gain structure. So I have to listen a lot. I have to listen to the sustain of their low end because they compress low end to their liking almost perfectly. But this one, it was doing too much overall to other elements that weren't feeling right. So this is gain staging. These are examples of understanding gain staging. And it's very important. But it's very important on how you get that headroom because you just minimize the sacrifice of vibe. And that's where I'm coming from, real life mixing in the moment. You can't just say, well, I'm giving myself 6 dB and then it's now better. Yeah. That's almost never the case.
Understanding conceptually what's happening is the really important part because, dropping things 6 dB is just basically saying I'm dropping the faders so then I have room to play with them and they're in a relationship. Because if you start with everything as loud as it's going to go, like I said, you can't go higher. So some people might go 6, some people might go 10, some people...
Yeah, I've gone more than 6. I'm just 6 to me is a safe starting place to understand. But yeah, go as far as you need to get that low end hitting right. This is how you dial in. When people ask like how I dial in low end, this is the answer. Then I can get my 808, my kick, my bass to hit with the right length for a full 60 hertz cycle to give me that length of the kick that I'm looking for. And then I can rebuild around that with the vocal and understand. And then I'll remake wherever that overly aggressive limiting from the rough mix was coming from. I'll figure it out. There are ways to do it. But let's just jump back to input and output. So if you have nothing on the track, clip gain that region down 6 dB. If it's going into a compressor, change that output of the compressor 6 dB. Is there an EQ after it? Do you want to put a trim plug in after it? However you want to do it, find a way that changes the output of that track or channel or whatever it is until you can lower it 6 dB if there's that character on it already. Yeah,
if there are plugins giving it character, make sure you're changing the volume at the end of the chain. Because if you change it going into it, it's going to change compression, distortion, that sort of thing.
Yes. So, but I would refrain from lowering the fader just sonically in DAWs. I would do it on a plugin and keep the faders at 0.
It's also conceptually, I mean, maybe this doesn't apply to a lot of people, but if you have everything fairly balanced and your faders are at 0 versus all over the place, it's like a cleaner work environment or something. Like
yes, you can commit the tracks. That's a really good question, Zach. Yes, you can commit the tracks, but why do you want to? What if you want to?
If you want to manipulate the sound.
After I'm talking about giving yourself headroom with it being exactly the same. Yes, of course you can commit the tracks. Just make sure you're committing it and it's not the processing that originated on the track is not doing harm. Yes, of course you can do that.
Yeah, well, let's see. There's one question that
anything pertain to this
was kind of nice about this, where talk about adding EQ plugins where you're boosting or adding a compressor plugin. People, do you change the output gain? And the answer I think is I was going to say it's mostly yes, that you want if you're putting some of the compressor plugins. I know you're not a big compressor guy in your mix, but a lot of the compressor plugins will actually add a little bit of gain.
It's annoying.
Which is annoying as fuck.
No, it's why I don't like compressor plugins.
You can change the defaults on a lot of these. I've done it with some of them that I use, but really, if you're going to add an EQ or add a compressor, as that applies to gain staging and signal flow, what you should do is you should have a signal that's about here. You add a compressor, and then the resulting signal is about the same level, just sounds a little compressed. That's the way to really adjust it. You're going to have to you add your compressor and then adjust the output gain and AB, so it's pretty similar. So you can actually hear what the compressor's doing and not be fooled by it.
Like it.
Yeah, not be fooled by it raising the volume in some respect. And then also, if it raises the volume, you're then changing the relationship across all of the multi-track, where all of a sudden one of your tracks is louder, and then you're pulling down you want things to come in and out at a very similar volume. Yeah.
So especially when you're in the mix process, producers and artists and managers and the teams have dialed in vibe, for weeks, a month, months, years, for so long. And you throw a compressor on a guitar track and it makes it 3 dB louder, but you're like, oh shit, that guitar sounds sick. Meanwhile, the background vocals now are covered by the strumming acoustic guitar that they were like, yo, that was an afterthought for rhythm. Like, we barely even wanted that there, but you're like, damn, that's so good. Like, yeah, that's on a Jason Mraz track, though. This is something else. Like, we don't need it to be up like that. You always have to be A-Bing what you're adding, because, well, what is it doing to the sound, and then what is it doing to the song, to the record? Just because the guitar sounds tight now doesn't mean the guitar was supposed to sound that good to begin with, right? So that's why you're adding this this plugin. Every plugin should be determined and deemed better or worse, I guess, for lack of better words. I kind of hate those words, but they do serve a purpose for educational things.
Yeah, when you're adding things into your chain, into your signal flow, something starting here, adding something in the middle, you don't want to then change the volume. The volume relationship should stay the same for the most part. I mean, maybe there's some reasons.
We really have to. This whole conversation, to me, I'm sure you'll agree, because this is one of the most important, especially for mixers. For mixers, this is the most important thing. I think when it comes to producers, it's equally as important, but they forget about it a lot of times in the room because of vibe. And and I think that's okay to some degree. I'd imagine you'd want to pull down your faders at the end of every day, just so the artist would live with I would do this every time as a mixer producer when I was in the room. Before I sent a mix out, I would change it, because
get your gain staging right,
so
you're not stuck into something.
Exactly. And the artist isn't really going to remember the difference that subtly of level, because the volume of the speakers changes in the room a lot when you're writing. So it's not like, oh, don't change it. This is not one of those don't change it things. This is one of those, I think you can change it and no one's going to know. And at the end of every day, let's get it back to that. So to the producers that are watching, I think it's something to consider in that space. But for mixers, this is the most important thing you can do to understand what the revision process is going to be like. So when someone asks you to turn up something a substantial amount, you can do it without it affecting everything else, right? And now that is sometimes extremely difficult with loudness, levels right now that producers are sending rough mixes out because of the thing I'm mentioning before about the end of the day, and they don't turn down because they don't either understand gain staging, think it's not cool, which is fine. Fuck if you don't think it's cool. Like, find an engineer that thinks it's cool and can handle it for you then, so you're not ruining fucking records. But I don't give a fuck about cool factor of engineering. I just think that overall headroom is cool, so people don't get boxed in.
Yeah. Let's maybe let's get to a couple questions. Okay, how do you think about Dylan asked about gain staging for transient rich signals? Do you have any particular thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's going to be part of this. How do you bring back, what is this question? It's a good question. How do you usually achieve bringing back the aggressive character of a limited rough mix? Yeah, this is like, this is the sauce, man. I can't be giving all of the sauce out. Just kidding.
Give it.
I've talked about this earlier on. I mean, exciters, multi-band saturators, so you can really refine the band that you're giving that aggression from. Let's say that there's an overall smashed mix that the kick drum is ducking everything, but also at the same time it's giving like maybe a synth, an overly aggressive upper mid range, but that sound itself doesn't actually have overly aggressive mid range, but it's the leveling of that sound that's bringing that forward, right? So I think, like, let's think of it this way. Here's the kick drum and here's the synth that actually exists, but because you're limiting it, you're starting to do this. So now the synth sounds like it has all this upper mid-range information, but when you take the limiter off, it actually doesn't. It sits back here. Now, a lot of that energy is great. It's like, say it's Prince, Juno, aggressive synth, buzzy thing and bright, and you need that for that chorus. But for some reason now it doesn't have that. Well, let's listen. Let's A/B. Well, where is that coming from? Is that between 1.5 and 3.5K? Like, where is that? Think numerically. As an engineer, we're supposed to hear those bands. It'll probably be pretty broad stroke and wide band. It'll probably not be super narrow and pointy. It'll probably be broad character, right? So take a saturating plugin that's multiband and take that and turn that shit up. Like, let's just turn it up as far as it goes. Like, I'll take the Ozone 8 exciter, for example, and I'll take that upper mid-range band and I'll distort it as far as it can go. And then I'll choose, I'll flip through all the different characters, whether it's tape, tube, warm, retro, whatever, triode, dual triode, all the ones that they have. And I'll see which one gives me the closest character, and I'll A/B between every fucking listen.
Yeah. And
I'll check which one's closest to that, which one's improving it. Is this clearly a better version of that now? Or is it just enough to resemble it? I might want to make it a bit more fully realized version of what that limiter was doing. But this is my game. This is what I'm in this for, is to correctly, without relying, as we talked about in earlier episodes, relying on one plugin that's giving all the vibe. How do we instill the vibe that one plugin was doing more independently, so there's more control over things? And this will let us have control over transients on each sound, so we can get things to be more activated feeling and exciting and energetic and not just flattened. Give you control over punch instead of faux punch, like that fake clipped kick drum punch that every fucking mix has. I'm like, that's not what kick sounded like. That's not what Dre's kick sound like. And Dre's shit, Kendrick shit, like Ali doesn't do shit like that. He's not broad stroked. You could hear him. You can hear his nuance. Like, that's what we want.
The thing that it seems like we're taking a step back, those are great details. What we're talking about with gain staging and signal flow, the reason to understand those is to be able to take, in this example, something that is extremely limited as a rough mix, but because you can basically just take a modern bunch of sounds, jam it through a limiter, and get a certain kind of excitement out of it. And that's what a lot of people will do. But you as a mixer, or the people out there that are really mixers, and it applies to producers, engineers as well, what you can do by understanding gain staging and how much headroom you have with limiters, things like that, is to basically decide how much of the mix bus glue versus getting the same effect with more control, more dynamic range, more transients. So it's not just, okay, it either goes through a limiter saturator on the mix bus or not. It's, okay, it's going through this much on the rough mix, and that's exciting, but I'm going to reduce it a bit and then use some of these tools and understanding the gain staging, but then understanding harmonic saturation, those sort of transient shaping, to achieve some of the same excitement while getting more dynamic range. I mean, that's, you talked about it a bit with your Khalid mix, because the Disclosure guys have such an amazing sound, and you were able to open it up just a little bit by understanding their gain staging, understanding what a great sound they got, but then doing some tweaking, reducing the level a little bit.
And very specifically with the intention to making it more R&B, less EDM, like their sound is, right? To make it more Khalid, more that artist. Not to do it because I wanted to do it, to do it because it was more appropriate for that artist. And
using these things for creative tools. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Understanding. So let's also on that note, just thinking historically in the last kind of 10, 20 years, when there's so many modern limiter tools have been around about that amount of time now, when you're in the room as a writer and a producer, there's nothing wrong with doing that broad stroke vibe mood to get it to be loud enough to hear it in your car. Like, I don't want to turn off people from doing that move. I just want to talk about that. I think that move should be temporary. And because we've all done it. I mean, I'm a mixer, but also when I was producing records, I did that. I put a limiter on harder than I would in a final mix, knowing I would be doing what I'm talking about now.
Because it's quick excitement. Because
Yes.
when you're in the creative flow, speed is often more important.
Yes, I don't want to demonize it. I don't want to say that people are doing the wrong thing. I think that can be used correctly. I would say maybe don't go over 4 dB of gain addition. Like I got on this pop thing I'm doing, there's 8 dB of reduction happening on a L2, and the faders are like, or the tracks are so quiet. All I have to do is clip gain everything up 8 dB and then not use the limiter. It's like it's a little bit dumb shit, to be honest. It's like a little bit. I mean, this is obvious. Like, why do you need to get 8 dB of gain when you actually have headroom on your tracks? Like that one doesn't really. I don't understand that one, to be honest.
But this is an understanding of gain staging, which is there is a reason to slap on a limiter to get volume at the end of a writing session. You want to go listen to it in a car or something like that. But understanding why you're doing something, Phil in there said intention. That's what we're always trying to talk about on here.
Always.
What are the fundamentals? Why are we doing things? How do they work? And then why would you use them? What is the purpose? And it doesn't mean you always have to have you take off the L2, you do no limiting, and you achieve everything with the transient shaper. It may be that some of the excitement can come out of that, but it's understanding what these tools do and then why you might want to use them.
Yeah. Understanding headroom, understanding tools, understanding all the things that make you a professional, right? We're supposed to understand the limits of this technology. I mean, that's what a professional does. An electrician goes in and knows the ins and outs of what it means to wire up a house or a commercial building. I'm supposed to know how to wire up a mix from start to finish. And if you don't and you're pretending, you're not going to last very long. Yeah. Because there's always going to be someone that knows it better and still has more vibe than you do, right? So that you have to know how it works from in and out. You have to.
Yeah, Edwin just asked on there, when do you use a limiter? And we were
Always.
just saying, yeah, there's all kinds of uses for all this stuff. I think the idea really being that if you're after speed, and Edwin's an artist and producer, that a lot of times you don't want to be spending, when you're writing a song, you don't want to be spending 30 minutes getting the transient just right to you're trying to get the excitement out. And so that's one of the places where, cool, strap on a limiter, get that level, go banging in the car.
Or pick a kick drum with the transient that you like.
Pick a kick. Yeah. So, and using these things where you use them quickly, but then when you're going to the mix stage, see if there's a better way to do that. And by understanding gain staging, how hard you're hitting the limiter, maybe you hit it about half as much, try some transient stuff. There's basically the reason is to give yourself more tools to achieve this kind of stuff.
I love circumstances like today where, because I had my headroom dialed in and I understood what was happening, when someone asked me for something, a kick drum a dB louder, and I know I'm already at my peak, like where I want that loudness to go, I was so set up that it was clear that note opened up Pandora's box and basically ruined the feel of the mix. And that triggered him to go, why don't we just turn everything down? And now it's a whole different mix. It's a whole different production in a sense. It grooves even more because I'm trying to maintain the rough mix. So I'm kind of leaving things the way that he had it because it's pretty dialed in. And now because of that move, we got to a mix that I think is better than even my match the rough vibe kind of mix too. Like, I think it got even better because the headroom issue made itself known quickly, which is super cool. And if you're not aware of that, then you're not going to capture that moment. That's a good luck moment. That's we both realized this. Well, let's fix it. And then all the fire emojis came after that, right? So you're like, oh yeah, well, we did something right.
Well, Alexander here asked a good question. It's sort of what I was talking about. When you're producing and the arrangement is changing a lot, how do you compensate for adding or taking away something? I think part of that answer is don't be mixing straight into a limiter right away. Because when you're producing, you're adding things, you're changing things, you're basically mixing on the fly. And that's why one of the reasons gain staging and understanding signal flow and gain staging is so important, because if you get a drum sound, a guitar and a bass, and then you limit the shit out of it, and then you're trying to add more stuff to it, then everything gets too tangled up and you don't have any headroom.
Yeah.
Things can kind of get fucked up that way. So understanding signal flow and gain staging, that's the reason to understand it. So you don't paint yourself into a corner.
Yeah, I think, man, I wouldn't have a limiter on if you're doing that. If you're arranging from the beginning and you're taking out your guitar, this is going to be a tricky one. I kind of want to work it out though. So say you're changing the voicings on your guitar and you got some low, thick voicings on the guitar and you're like, actually, I want to voice this higher. So you're now, you have less body to the guitar sound because of how you're voicing it, but because you have a limiter on, you might be getting faux body to the guitar still. It's like, we don't want that. We want the right body in the guitar determined by the guitar voicing and the sound of the guitar, not by the limiter. I mean, no one's ever chose their sonic arrangement based on a limiter. I mean, they might have, not intentionally, right? That's that's a by accident. Oh, there's so much compression and limiting happening. Everything has body to it. And you take it off, and it's the thinnest record you've ever heard. This is all the time.
This is something that I've run into a lot as a producer, where you write a song with an artist. I had this a while back. Write a song, get a demo together, send it pretty quickly. Then they're like, okay, we want to try a different kind of production vibe. So we do a whole different production thing, get it together. I deliver something that sounds like a pretty finished mix. It's got, it's at a certain level, everything's really slamming. And they say, can we try adding another bass and another guitar in the chorus? Because they just want to thicken it up. And we're still in sort of production mode. We're trying things. But then all of a sudden I have to think about the gain staging, because what I've done is I basically delivered a mix. I mean, it's not a final finished mix. I would send it to John. He would do some other things to it. But it's a mix. Everything is at a certain level. Everything is popping. I have automation on there. But then it's like, okay, we're going to take this thing that's glued together in a certain way and add another significant element in the chorus. I have to actually reduce everything, if only to play a guitar and hear it properly, because I don't have any more room to go up without it just sounding super squished and super compressed. So I need to understand what I've done with my gain staging, pull everything down a bit, take the master stuff off, and then kind of rebuild. And it's annoying to think about it as like, oh, I can't just add a guitar and just go like plus guitar and then it works. But that's what you have to do. I mean, that's what you have to do as a professional record maker, and get in the habit of rebuilding things a lot of the time. I mean, you've even talked about this with mixes. If you don't get a mix quite right, which is rare, but you've done it before, you'll just save as and start from scratch again and rebuild the gain again.
Oh, I meant to say that about the Volta thing. I said, hey, I'm doing this, but if you don't like this approach, I can do a more preservative mix approach tomorrow. That was going to be the end of that comment. It's like allowing them to know this is what I'm going to mix it as though I hear the record that I think that you were going for. And if not, we can always go back to your gain staging and have a more preservative approach, because I like you and fuck with you. I don't really want to do that for everybody, because sometimes I don't really care about like some shitty overcompressed mix. I can't get my head around those. I don't want to.
Oh, so can you address Zach's question? Really, you said you mix.
Yes, I send it at that volume. Yeah, I was going to just jump in and just quickly say yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
The peak's at 0. Yeah. I just care about my overall LUFS and average loudness, and the master gets sent at 0. Yes.
Yeah. So the master gets.
I don't have a pre-master mix. I don't do that. I just mix with headroom.
You mix with headroom, and you're not putting tons of limiting and stuff on your shit anyway. Whatever a mastering engineer may or may not do is sort of up to them. But your LUFS is certainly not at 0. It's significantly. No,
it's usually -10, between -8 and -12.
Yeah, but so some things will be peaking around 0, and you try to give them again.
Everything peaks at 0. Everything.
Talking about dynamic range, you want to maximize what you have there, so you sort of get it up as high as you can. You want to jump into a few other specific questions here?
Sure, let's try.
Well, you actually talked about it before, but maybe you could just repeat it again. Your approach to Jake asked big kicks as it relates to gain staging. You sort of addressed it in a few ways here already, but I know you love talking about kick drum because that's such a fundamental part of your mixes and psychologically how you feel mixes. Do you want to talk? You talked about it both with your mix today. You talked about it with the you talked about Khalid stuff in the past. What you got any? Thinking about John hearing my mix gives me anxiety. Yeah.
No. I wouldn't. I don't ever want anybody to feel that way, to be honest.
So, any other thoughts about kicks as regards gain staging? I guess we did kind of cover it a bit.
I mean, the only way to get the proper full length of a kick drum is to have proper gain staging. That's like a pretty broad concept. And if you want to get full low extended low end, you need to have headroom. You need to have room for a full 60 hertz cycle to develop.
You've said this a few times, but that's one of the reasons if you take all your multi-track and you lower your faders, you then pop up the kick drum and sort of see what that feels like. I don't know if it literally with the faders, but you talk about bringing everything down and then having the kick drum really anchor the mix. That's a big part of how you...
Well, yeah, I turn everything down, give myself headroom, and I turn the kick up until it hits where I want it to hit. I turn the vocal up till it hits where it was hitting, because vocals are usually really loud in the rough mix.
Yep.
9 times out of 10, the vocals are the loudest thing in the rough mix and the kick drum. So if you're giving yourself that headroom, now you can actually get them to feel right together. Usually sit like this. I like the vocal a little behind the kick just because the low end is not as forward. You'll filter the, I try to do things.
Sorry, are you talking about volume level? Are you talking?
No, like a perspective. Like this is the perspective of a mix. You can go flat or you can like get that back wall. I like to mix with a back wall. Let me just get my hands right. So like this is where your like effects would be, your time-based effects all the way in the back.
So what I'm looking at is like you're doing like this basically. Like this is the front,
exactly.
This is the back. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Just give me a side view.
Yeah, because you can't tell.
I like how many hand
this
signals. This is going to be the snapshot of the IGTV. Which, by the way, people are asking. You can watch all these on IGTV. We're putting them up on YouTube as well.
Let's get the vocal dancing back here and the kick up front. And we're talking about specific genres of music. Like more R&B and hip hop.
Modern R&B, hip hop, pop.
Yeah, the kick, they might be a bit more even, or the kick might be a tiny bit behind it with a little poke up front, but the low end might be more compressed behind, or it changes. I tend to mix with my kicks out front. I know a lot of my peers mix that way too. A lot of us just like loud kicks and loud vocals. So
I mean, that's the sound of music today. I mean, it's getting your. So when you're reducing faders to, you then get your kick to where you want it to be. You get the vocal to where roughly you want it to be, and then you're building around from there. That's the fundamental of how you. There's a lot of questions about how do you actually set up a mix. So aside from
that's how I set up a mix.
Aside from doing clip gain or at the end of chains after the the audio file, and it goes through a saturator and compressor or whatever, and adjusting the output of that so everything is hitting where you want it to be. You're actually physically moving the faders down 6 dB, popping up the kick drum, popping up the vocal to where those have a relationship. Again, you do this a lot, so you can.
I'm not physically moving the faders down. I wanted to make sure that. Yeah. The faders are staying at 0 physically. The faders don't move. It's getting everything down 6 dB without moving the faders, which is what I was trying to get across. So I just want to correct that because I don't want people to think that.
Okay, so that's a good answer to those. Okay.
But yeah, get that kick drum to hit where you want it to hit. And the only way to do that is headroom. Because the minute you turn up a kick drum into a limiter, the limiter is now dictating the length of the kick. And also, that brings me to something I wanted to say when you were talking a bit ago before we went into this next question, which is every week I tend to challenge someone to do something. I have an overall challenge, which is know where your vibe is coming from. So if you want your vibe to come from one limiter on your mix bus, then let it be known that that's where the vibe is coming from. But if you want the vibe to be coming from each sound choice, how they fit together in arrangement, the song, the vocal approach, the distortion on the vocal that's vibey and cool, the crunch of the drums that are coming from a drum bus that's giving a bit of glue to it, just let it be known where the vibe is coming from. So I challenge you to go back to your most recent production or mix and say, where is this coming from? Take off your mix bus and where is the vibe coming from? And then work backwards from there and just understand it. Because there's nothing wrong with doing what everyone's doing. I think a lot of people are doing it without understanding what they're doing, understanding what a limiter does, what different types of saturation do, and then it's locked in for the long haul, and you can't get out, and then a mixer can't get out of it either, then everyone loses because everyone's like, wait, where did the rough vibe go? And it's like, the vibe of the rough, you said you didn't even like, but that's the last thing that was. Anyway, you know, there's a lot to go off there.
A way to think about this, I think, is if you use a limiter at the end of the process to smash your mix, it does create a vibe, but it's essentially one version and it's one vibe. And it's probably not right for most things. If you understand gain staging and using saturators and transient shapers and things like that, you have a lot more options for achieving different versions of that same result. A limiter will do it one way. Understanding gain staging, dealing with transients, compressors, subgroups, that sort of things will give you a lot more options for how you want something to sound.
Yeah, let's check another question.
Oh shoot, I didn't write down who asked this question, but asking about two things that you did. Are there differences in gain staging fundamentals from a live organic record like Younger Days by, how do you say
Joy Oladukin?
Her name?
Joy Oladukin.
Oladukin, as compared to Another Opinion by Megan Trainor, both of which you mixed and produced?
I produced both of them. I mixed the Joy record. I recorded, produced, and mixed the Joy record. And Another Opinion, I co-produced, and Serban mixed it.
Okay.
I mixed the other Megan records on that album, but Serban wound up mixing that one.
Differences between live organic.
They're both very different, but I was in charge of the initial gain staging on both of them. And Serban's mix is not very far from my rough mix. I think he just compressed low end more and made the vocal harsher and brighter, and like, I guess did his thing to that and made the vocal forward. Yeah, which is cool. It worked. I had no real notes except for I thought the low end was a little too compressed, but not make or break for me. But the gain staging was very similar, except for on the Younger Days, since I recorded everything with ribbon mics and tube pre's to my desired liking, up in the loft with all live instruments. And by default, live instruments are going to have more dynamic range, right? I didn't use any compressors on the recording at all. I don't think there's any compressors on the entirety of that. There is a limiter on the mix bus on the Joy record on Younger Days, but there's no compressors at all. There's no 1176s. There's no LA2A plugins. There's no anything. There is a lot of saturation, both from the tube preamps as I'm recording them and driving them, as on groups, on subgroups.
And as I want to point out to people always, saturation and those sort of things compress the sound. They are not a compressor, but saturation is a form, includes in addition to harmonic information being added and changed. Also,
but these tubes don't quite do that. They keep dynamic range pretty much as they were, yet they have this illusion of moving things forward. It's very subtle. So that I had more control over. Now, on the Another Opinion thing, I was actually brought in by one of my best friends, Tyler Johnson, who produced it, to co-produce. And I went in the room with him and Megan. I think it was at East West Studios at the time. Before I took it back to my spot, I spent a day there with them. And my job was they asked me to kind of sort it out. They felt like it was too busy. And it's funny, the first thing I did, I dropped everything 6 dB and I started soloing the fundamental elements. I basically sat down to mix the record, right? And then we'd unsolo things, or we'd solo something else, we'd unmute something else, and Tyler and Megan would be like, I don't think we need that thing anymore, right? I was like, yeah, I was thinking the same thing, right? So my job was to assess arrangement, and I use gain staging to assess the arrangement. So that's a great question to ask by whoever asked that, because I was hired to do that without them saying like, oh, you need to gain stage to... I got additional co-production credit because I changed the arrangement of things by giving them headroom to hear the mess that was going on. Super cool process.
Gain staging provided you another tool to adjust a song. I mean, it's understanding signal flow.
I'm a producer and arranger. I think of myself as a mixer who understands arrangement, right? That's what I'm listening for. So when I'm soloing things and seeing the relationships between them, I'm thinking of arrangement. I'm thinking about if I don't know the songwriter or the producer in the room, I'm imagining being in the room, being like, oh, this is why they did this part. This is where this one sits, right? So that was a case where I actually got to assert my opinion, no pun intended there. I was given another opinion and I started muting things and created space in the arrangement because now we could hear it all. I don't remember any specific things that were muted, but there were so many things going on. Like I soloed 4 elements, and it was like, oh, that's the record. And I was like, oh, sick. See, that's what I do in a mix process anyway. When we're talking about soloing the kick, the bass, maybe the snare and the vocal, and getting those things to hit right, that's because those are the fun, and a chordal element usually. Those are the fundamental elements of what the human ear is going to perceive in the record anyway. We can't hear more than 3 things at a time, so there shouldn't be more than 5 things that are even important in the mix, because your brain's going to have to shift focus from one to the other anyway, because we only hear 3, or only perceive 3.
Yeah.
So that was my job on that. So gain staging was super important to the production of that record, and same to the Joy thing. I wanted it to feel like you were in my loft. And for those of you that can't see completely, like, this is where we recorded it. Like right there. There were horns here, there were strings, like there was everything, and I just put those gobos around it, right? Like it was in here. I wanted you to feel like you were in here. And if you throw a limiter on, that's not the vibe anymore. The vibe isn't in the room, in the loft. And so anyway.
Well, it sounds like those are great examples of what you do. It sounds like by and large, I mean, I think the answer to most of the questions about like kick drum or transients or live instruments or whatever, the fundamentals of gain staging, understanding them will kind of answer all those questions for you.
Yeah.
Because if you understand how a signal goes from here into a compressor, into a mix bus, into whatever, like if you take something that is completely unprocessed and uncompressed, that's a real drum in a room, it's going to have a wider dynamic range. You're going to be dealing with a different type of signal than, say, a plug-in that's going to be hitting a sample that's going to be hitting exactly the same volume each time it hits. Obviously, people will play them sometimes or change the dynamics, but when it comes to live versus more programmed pop stuff, you're just kind of dealing with a different dynamic range, which gets back to, understanding if you actually play softly an acoustic guitar versus, I don't know, play it on Omnisphere or something. Omnisphere is going to have a much tighter dynamic range versus somebody actually performing it. Someone who performs wildly on it and doesn't have great control over their ability to play guitar might require a different kind of processing and a different thinking about where it fits into the gain structure, might require compression or saturation.
But also thinking about that on that younger days, on that Joy record, the whole time from the recording to the mixing, my goal, our goal, the team's goal, everybody that was there, Joy's goal was, I still want this to sound competitively loud. So if you put it next to Ariana Grande, it still has that same pop density. But how are we getting that? Are we getting that from smashing an overall mix? Are we getting that from oversaturating the guitars so they're bright enough? Getting the horns up in that space, like arrangement. How are we voicing the strings? How is Rob doing that? How is Rob Moose doing that? That's how we're creating the arrangement that dense, so we're not relying on a limiter to get it there. But that record is at 0, and the LUFS is like -10, -9. It's loud. It's equally as loud to my Khalid mixes and Harry Styles mixes and everything that I was doing at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing different about that to say like, oh, I want it to sound like it's from the 60s, so I'm going to leave it really quiet with 14 dB of headroom. It's like, no, that shit's all with the same intention of, if that wanted to be played on the radio or viral top 50 Spotify chart, like, it can hang. That's very, very intentional. That needs to always be the intention if you're trying to be competitive in this, in popular music, right? Like, you do need to consider that. So I'm not trying to tell people that they need to be super quiet. I think dynamic range wins to a degree most of the time, but within a certain window. Let's like be real here,
I think by and large people are making things with smaller dynamic range. It's too loud, that's going to get turned down by the streaming algorithms anyway. So this is why understanding gain staging and signal flow is so important. It actually gives you more tools, because the formats that people consume, through which people consume music these days, actually allow for a lot more dynamic range than just slapping a limiter on. We got about 5 minutes left. We covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that was good.
Let's see. Bit rates. I think everything is 32-bit. I mean, converters.
I still get files sent at 16, and I just say, "Can you resend at 32, please?"
Yeah, I mean, everything's 32.
Don't fucking dither, man. I don't understand it. Why?
Everything should be processed because 32-bit just gives you all more dynamic range once you're in the computer.
Yeah. Oh, also, let's just throw in something. I meant to say this earlier.
Yeah.
I don't want to minimize the idea of getting vibe from clipping and peaking. Like, for example, Fruity Loops, drums that clip Fruity Loops have a vibe. I'm not saying don't clip Fruity Loops, but
you want it to be deliberate. Intention.
Yeah, that's intentional. But what I'm saying is when I mix something from Fruity Loops, I give headroom so I can make sure that the character of those Fruity Loop clip drums still can hit the same way, right? Like I've mixed for Boy Wonder on your 24-bit. Oh man, fuck you guys. I knew you were. Resend those stems. No, I'm just kidding. Don't do that word. But yeah, I was mixing for Boy Wonder on a Nicki Minaj thing, and like I heard that Fruity Loops clipping. I'm not fucking with Boy Wonder's drums. I'm not trying to ruin his vibe, right? But I still gave myself headroom, and I made that shit knock. He didn't say like the drums don't knock anymore because I was listening.
It's the same thing we were saying about you start with a dry signal, and then if it has a selection of or a collection of plugins on them that have distortion, compression, whatever, you're not adjusting this level because you want the relationship into the distortion, the compression, saturation to be the same. You're manipulating the output of it. So if Boy Wonder is sending you Fruity Loops drums, they're going to have that character of crunch in them already, and that's a beautiful tool. I mean, it's one of the reasons people like Fruity Loops so much.
Yeah, exactly. So I just don't want to be talking about headroom and thinking that like every DAW is one size fits all. That's not true. There is vibe from clipping Fruity Loops. Clipping Ableton just makes things sound really small, and Pro Tools just sounds like shit when you clip it.
Yeah.
So there's really no vibe from those two. Logic too. It just sounds soft when you clip Logic. So I think Fruity Loops is probably the only one that has a vibe when you clip it. I think Cubase kind of has a thing. It's digital. It sounds like a bit too like crystal-y for me when you clip Nuendo and Cubase. It sounds like I don't know.
I haven't used it in so long. That was my first program.
Same was one of mine. I used to love it for that purpose, and then it was like, ooh, but it doesn't sound warm when it clips. Like Fruity Loops has this kind of gushy, kind of fat thing. Anyway, I don't want to go one size fits all with any of these things. But when you're talking about a final mix, production, arrangement, it shouldn't clip.
Yeah.
Just bits of things can clip. Kick drums can clip. Snare drums can clip. But the overall mix should definitely.
One thing I want to cover on here, we got about a minute or two left. We kind of covered the basics of the questions. There's a lot more questions, but I think we kind of covered everything. Within plugins, that's something that people really need to be careful of. Keep your levels low, inputs and outputs, and not lower than anything else. But just as we're talking about, don't be hitting 0 on your EQ plugin because you may be losing bits of transient. If you have saturation plugins, maybe pat it down for the next plugin, so you're not hitting red on your plugins unless you want a very
use your input and output. That's why they're there.
Yeah.
Every plugin at this point, I'm pretty sure, has an input and output. Even the OTT. When you put that damn OTT plugin on, you're nipping transients. It's getting you faux punch. Everyone that's using it, it's on this mix today, and I'm just like, I'm not succumbing to it. I'm taking that shit off. I think I wound up putting it on the drums and the bass half wetness, like they had half mix, because it was giving vibe that I'm like, I don't like this song enough to like really dive in on. But it's off the vocal, it's off the keyboard. It's like, fuck that on everything, putting the OTT on the mix. I'm sorry, fuck that.
Well, so again, we're talking about gain staging. So at every stage, at everything that your signal is going to go through, signal flow, everything that it flows through, every stage of it has the potential for clipping, distortion, good or bad. Just be aware of every stage of the process. We got about a minute left. I think we probably call it here. Hopefully we answered a bunch of your guys' questions. DM me if you got other questions we didn't cover. All this stuff is going to be, people are loving it.
OTT is fire independently, not on the whole mix. I'm sorry, and you know that.
All right, John's going to go on live after this and rail on OTT.
I know.
So hit me up if you got any other questions. All this stuff on my IGTV. We're putting more episodes up on the YouTube channel, just kind of making it useful for people. So let us know what you like, specific topics. Shout out Topo Chico, sponsor us. Love you guys. Just DM me with any other questions. Appreciate. Love you, John. Thank you, bro. This was a good one.
That was super fun.
All right. Bye, guys.
Peace.